Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Beyond the Sea webinar. My name is Tony Nguyen, and today we are welcoming Lisa Federer, who is the Research Data Informationist from the National Institutes of Health Library. Lisa currently serves there where she provides training and support in the management, organization, sharing, and reuse of biomedical research data. She is the author of several peer-reviewed articles and the editor of the Medical Library Association Guide to Data Management for Librarians. She holds a Master's of Library and Information Science from the University of California, Los Angeles, and graduate certificates in Data Science at Georgetown University and Data Visualization at New York University. And she is a doctoral student at the University of Maryland. Everyone, please welcome Lisa.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm really glad to be here with all of you today and excited to share some of what is really my passion in terms of working with data and data science. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover today in the next hour, talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about big data. Is this something that is just a buzzword, or is this something that actually has real meaning? We'll talk about what data science is all about. So if you've heard the term used before but weren't really sure what exactly that entails, hopefully at the end of the session today you'll have a better idea of what that means. We'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics of data science, including the data science pipeline, which is sort of like the data science version of the scientific method, and some specific data science methods and techniques that are currently widely used in biomedical research applications. Talk just a little bit about some of the tools that data scientists use, and then at the end, sort of do a little, sort of foresight, looking ahead, and talk about what are some of the developments that are potentially coming up in the next 5 to 10 years that we should be aware of. And then I will talk a little bit about, how can libraries be involved in this sort of work? So I am, as Tony mentioned, at the NIH Library. We are the library for intramural researchers at the NIH. About 80% of the NIH budget goes out to fund research at your institutions. And the remaining 20% stays at the NIH to fund the intramural research that happens mostly here in Bethesda and a couple of other sites. And so we are the library that serves those researchers. So very similar probably to some of the researchers that you serve at your institutions. So I'll talk a little bit about how we're supporting data management and data science at the NIH. So big data, what is it? We've probably all heard the word big data thrown around, used quite a bit, both in popular media and the scientific world. But what exactly are we talking about when we talk about big data? Is there any real meaning to this term, or is it just a buzzword? I'm seeing in the chat that there's a problem with the audio for some people. Tony, am I sounding okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
I'll message her directly.
Okay, just wanted to double check that I'm not talking to an empty room here. All right, so big data, is it just a buzzword? How big do data have to be considered big data? And how is big data different from small data or medium data? And why is that distinction important? So one very basic definition of big data is that this would be a data set that's too large or too complex to be dealt with using traditional data processing, analysis, and storage techniques. So if you've ever tried to open a really big spreadsheet in Excel, you'll find that it slows down or it crashes entirely. Excel can only handle about 1 million lines of data. So that's just an example of how many of the tools that we have traditionally used for computation just can't handle large data sets. So if we want to take advantage of the wealth of data that is available to us today, we have to develop new technologies that make it possible to deal with these very large data sets in meaningful ways. So to expand on this idea a little bit, this sort of concept of big data, one meaningful way to think about big data is to consider the 4 V's that characterize big data. So the first V is volume, or the amount of data. So this is where that sort of concept of big in terms of size comes in. There's no single agreed upon cutoff size that makes data big versus medium versus small. But again, big data typically involves a volume of data that's large enough that it can't be effectively analyzed or stored using traditional computational tools. However, it's not just about the size of the data. The second V is variety, or bringing together many different types of data that all work together to help researchers make discoveries. For example, if we were to study cancer today, we might bring together images from one or more imaging modalities, an MRI of a patient, a CT. We would probably have some clinical data in the form of lab values, blood tests that had been done. We'd probably have some text from the clinician, narrative about the patient and how they were doing on the day that the clinician saw them. We'd probably also have some of the patient's genetic sequence. So we have images, genetic sequences, clinical data, free text. All of this would give us a really comprehensive view of the patient, and we would really need all of this data to have the sort of overall 360 view that will allow us to make meaningful discoveries. But it also presents a really big challenge of figuring out, how do we integrate all of this? How do we bring all of these disparate types of data together and make sense out of all of this? And this is a really big challenge that researchers are facing. The third V is velocity, or the speed at which data are generated. We're able today to generate data at a really unprecedented rate. In fact, IBM has estimated that we are generating 2.5 billion gigabytes of data every single day. A really good example of this is the Large Hadron Collider. The data that's generated in just a few seconds from a single experiment, so massive that it takes researchers all around the world months to analyze just that data that's generated so quickly in one quick experiment. And then finally, the fourth V is veracity, which highlights the importance of data quality and trustworthiness. There's a lot of data available today from various different sources, but not all of the data that we can access is good or high quality. There's the saying in computer science about garbage in, garbage out. That is true of data-driven research as well. So if we want to achieve research results that we can trust and that are reproducible and verifiable, we must ensure that we're using high-quality data. Again, some of the data that we find in public sources may be suspects because of, probably we've all heard of stories of retracted articles that, there were findings of research misconduct, but even just low quality data in terms of data that doesn't have the adequate metadata to really know exactly how it was collected or what exactly it means. These are all problems that come along with this sort of concept of big data. So that sort of, sums up the definition of what we're really talking about when we talk about big data. But I do also want to take a moment here to emphasize that big data isn't the only data that we should be paying attention to. There's really very exciting work that's being done to leverage big data, but there's also a lot going on with small data. So many of the concerns and issues that I'll be talking about here are relevant to all researchers who work with digital data in any form, whether it's big or small or whatever discipline they're in. And I do also want to emphasize that there's a distinction between big data and data science, although it sometimes seems that people are using those terms interchangeably. But we'll talk a little bit more about what sort of data science is all about. But again, big data sort of gets all the attention, but there's a lot of really important opportunities to work with researchers who are working with those smaller or more moderately sized data sets, and they need assistance with a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about as well. So how have we arrived at this sort of era of big data and data science? Why is this something that's become important in research today? Part of the reason we have so much data now is that we're able to generate data more quickly and more cheaply than ever before. The case of genomic data provides a really useful example for this. So what you're seeing here on this chart is the cost to sequence a single human genome from 2001 to 2015. This is a chart that is provided by the National Human Genome Research Institute. So by the time the first human genome was sequenced in 2003, the Human Genome Project that you've probably heard of, it took about 10 years to do that, just one single human genome, and it cost about $2.7 billion. Today, it's 15 years later, we can do that same work of sequencing a single human genome in about 26 hours, and it costs about $1,000. So this is a really significant decrease in both time and cost. And so you can see here that this has, really dropped precipitously in the last several years, far outpacing the white line, which is Moore's law, which states that computing power typically doubles every 2 years. So we've, vastly, overachieved really with how quickly and cheaply we can do things. And so we're able to generate all this data. And, also storing it is becoming cheaper and easier. So we can generate huge amounts of data and we can keep it sort of almost indefinitely. Another sort of driver behind this rise in how we're able to generate data so quickly is that we're really collecting data all around us all the time more than ever before. Sensors that gather really highly specialized data used to be something that was, a big, bulky thing, hard to take out into the field, expensive if you lost it. But we have sensors now that are so cheap and so small that we can basically wear them around, carry them with us wherever we go. Probably if you are listening to this now, you are within reach of your smartphone. Mine is sitting right here. And the smartphone that you have is an incredibly sophisticated data sensor and collection device that is able to generate data about you and the world around you pretty much all the time. So you can go online right now and get instructions about how to build an air pollution sensor in about an hour using components that altogether cost less than $50. Some of you may have or be wearing some of these wearable sensors like the Fitbit or that one that's like a necklace. I forget what it's called, but it's the same sort of idea as a Fitbit where it tracks your steps and it also tracks your respiratory rate, so it's able to tell you if you're stressed out or need to, relax a little bit more and meditate. So we have all of these sensors that are around us sort of doing other things and giving us data about the world in general, but we're able to save that data and then take advantage of that for scientific purposes. There's also been an increase in the amount of what's called born digital data. So this refers to data that originates as digital data rather than being converted or digitized later. A really good example of this is the move to electronic health records. So clinical data used to be primarily collected in the form of paper charts. You'd go to your doctor, he or she would write some stuff down in your chart, it would get filed. But now providers are using mostly electronic health records. The paper data that used to be collected by your clinician was really unusable for researchers because it just sat there in those charts in the clinician's office, and it would be really costly and time-consuming to either try to go to all of those offices and collect that data or to try to digitize all of that. But now researchers can potentially conduct research really easily and quickly using electronic health record data because it's all already collected digitally and potentially available for researchers. So many researchers now, are able to use this. Of course, privacy issues are another concern, but the fact that we have so much digital data available really presents a lot of promise. Many researchers are also switching to electronic lab notebooks or ELNs, whereas they used to record all of their lab observations in paper lab notebooks. Another thing that some researchers are doing is instead of using an ELN program that you have to input all of your data into a computer, is using smart pens, which write like a regular pen, and they use paper. So you have the sort of feel of a paper lab notebook. You have the actual physical paper record that you can carry with you, but it also digitally records every single mark so that a digital and searchable copy is also created electronically that you can then save and access and take with you. And then we also have a lot of apps that make it possible to collect all sorts of information. The example that you see on the bottom left-hand corner there is one that's called City Noise. It uses smartphones to gather information about noise levels out sort of in the wild, in public, and to track noise pollution in cities. So sort of turning people into data collectors all around. Social media even has potential research uses. So Twitter and Facebook posts have been used to do things like track the spread of disease, where people writing that they've gotten the flu, you can sort of track disease that way. Drug use is one. There was a study that used Twitter and looked at college students and, them writing about, oh, I'm taking, this drug right before I have to go do my final exam or whatever. Other epidemiological studies are also things that researchers have used social media data for. So not only are we generating a lot of data, but more and more of this data is available for researchers to use. And often it can be easily accessed from a repository, something as simple as going to a web page, searching for the data that you want, and then downloading it, and you have access to it. Many of these repositories are fully open and accessible, allowing anyone, anywhere that has internet access to access the data. Others, particularly those containing any sort of information about human subjects, sort of human genetic information, typically require users to apply for access, so you have to, complete an IRB and, get permission to actually access this data. There are a lot of different types of repositories. Subject-specific repositories are available from many disciplines, so researchers sort of know if you want to look for example, my favorite repository logo is the mouse genome. I forget what the I stands for, but the cute little mouse on the top right-hand corner of the screen. If you want mouse genome data, to go to the mouse genome repository. Some of these repositories are also more broad in focus, so they take pretty much any kind of data. For example, the Dryad that is on there is one that you can pretty much submit anything you want, any format, any subject matter. They will take it. And then also some institutions have their own repositories where researchers can post their data. So for example, if I'm a researcher at UCLA, I will put my research in the UCLA repository. So lots of different options for people that either want to find a place to share their data or to look for data that they can reuse. And again, all of this, availability of data makes it possible for us to sort of leverage this and make new discoveries. A final driver behind the sort of rise of big data and data science is sharing mandates. Some researchers choose of their own volition to share their data because they feel like it's a good thing to do to contribute to the scientific community, but not everyone feels that way. So some data ends up in repositories because the researcher is actually required to share their data. A lot of journals now make it a requirement of publication that the data that supports an article has to be shared and available at the time the article is published. Many very large journals are doing this. So for example, the Nature Publishing Group, BMJ, PLOS, all require that if they're going to publish your article, people have to be able to access the data to see how those conclusions were drawn. Funders also have begun to require data sharing through new policies that apply to often federally funded research, but even some private funders are doing this. So, if you're getting this federal funding, you're going to be expected to share your data. So regardless of a researcher's specific area of interest, it's very likely that they will face some sort of sharing requirement, whether from the journal that they're going to publish in or the funder that's giving them the grant to do their research. So now I think is really a good time for librarians to be talking to researchers about the fact that they will be expected to share their data and to have it in some sort of a shareable form that other people will understand, when it gets to the end of the project and they have to put it in a repository. So, sort of the upshot of all of this, again, is that as a result of these sorts of mandates, we are going to have even more data available for reuse in the future. So we've talked about big data, the fact that there's a lot of data out there and available, and one of the ways that people are taking advantage of this is by using data science methodologies. So what are we talking about when we talk about data science? To an extent, all science uses data, but data science is a very particular sort of approach to exploring data and making discoveries. One way of thinking about it is that it requires and sort of makes use of a variety of different types of skills to both process data, to analyze it, to visualize it, to get some sort of knowledge out of it. So it involves all of the sorts of skills that you see here. First of all, you have to have sort of a math and statistical background to be able to find patterns and do analysis of large data sets. You also need computational skills. Most data science is done writing code, using things like R or Python, but you also need, sorry, I'm doing this webinar from home and my dog, Ophelia, decided that she wanted to chime in. She finds data science also very fascinating, so I apologize if you're hearing her bark in the background. So you are bringing together this math and statistical expertise, the computing expertise, but also you need domain expertise to sort of reality check your findings and know if what you are discovering in this data is actually a true pattern that makes sense with sort of the science of what you know about the subject area. Okay, so another way to think about this is you may have seen this Venn diagram before. You sort of need all of these three types of skills to bring together to accomplish data science and to get some sort of knowledge out of data. So I mentioned earlier that data science is a little bit different than the traditional scientific method. So you probably remember back to elementary school and you learned about the scientific method. And typically this starts with you have a hypothesis. You observe the world around you and you come up with an idea about something that you think is true. And the idea is to devise an experiment that allows you to test that hypothesis. And you do that experiment, you gather data, and then you sort of analyze all of that data, and then you find out that either yes, that hypothesis was true, and now you've discovered something new, you confirmed your hypothesis, or no, you find out that the data actually don't support your hypothesis, you reject it, and then you maybe come up with a new hypothesis. So if I were going to say test a drug in this way, I would hypothesize that drug A would cause a remission in cancer in patients. I would give the drug to patients, have a control group, compare those two, and find out if that drug actually worked. This, again, sort of the traditional scientific method. You're probably familiar with this, makes a lot of logical sense. Data science is a little bit different in terms of how it often progresses, partly because a lot of times there's not necessarily a hypothesis in advance. So we might have a very large data set and we don't necessarily know what is significant or what we might find when we look at it. But by using certain approaches or algorithms or techniques, we're able to find patterns in data and therefore get meaning out of it. So one of the things that I've had conversations with researchers about before is that when they're doing data science and they want to get access to maybe one of those data sets that requires IRB approval, they're sort of stumped about how to go about doing IRB approval, because usually that process involves stating your hypothesis. What is it that you're looking for? And they don't necessarily know in advance exactly what they're looking for, but they have a feeling that they can find something significant in that data set. So while data science sort of builds on and uses this traditional scientific method, I think a better way of thinking about the process that data scientists go through is this data science pipeline. So the way that data scientists typically work is that we start with data ingestion, which basically involves getting data from some source. This might be, in some cases, collecting data yourself, but more typically it would be locating data in a repository. It might be asking for data from a collaborator, but somehow you acquire data for your analysis. A huge part of the work of data science is this second step, which is labeled here as data munging or wrangling, also sort of data cleaning, data processing. about 80% of the work of data science is just getting the data into some sort of a format that's usable for your analysis. Part of the reason this is so time-consuming is that often, since we are reusing data that was collected for, some other purpose, most likely by someone else, it's not necessarily in the form that I might need to do my analysis. So, for example, if I wanted to use patient data that had been collected in an electronic health record, that data was collected with the purpose in mind of providing a record of that patient's health for the clinician, not necessarily for a researcher. So the way that I would like to see the data organized is not necessarily the same way as the data was collected and the way that a clinician would find it useful. So a big part of that work is that data munging or wrangling or processing, however you want to call it. Once the data is in the form that you're ready to use it, computation and analysis is carried out. Typically, this involves a lot of statistical knowledge using statistical sort of techniques that you may have heard of if you've ever taken a biostatistics class. And then once that analysis is done, we're able to develop some sort of model of, basically how this data works, what are the patterns, what are the implications for sort of real-world practice, and have those, applications for that in the real world. I'll talk a little bit more about some specific examples of this that I think will make sense. And then finally, we have to share our results, and so reporting and visualization would be that final step where we, create maybe some sort of a dashboard that we can share the data, create a final report, whatever it might be. As with most scientific processes, we have these, in the model, we have these sort of, distinctive boxes and arrows going back and forth. In real life, it's very rarely the case that you neatly, follow these steps in this exact order and one step starts as soon as another one ends. It's typically a very iterative process, but these are sort of the 5 basic steps involved in doing data science. So, what are we talking about when we actually talk about the techniques that we're using? One of the very common techniques that's used in data science is what's called machine learning. This is basically taking data and analyzing them using a particular algorithm. There are lots and lots of different algorithms available depending on the type of data that you're using and the relationships within those data. A model is developed from that algorithm to explain patterns within that data and potentially allow us to make predictions about similar data. And there are 2 types of machine learning, and I'll talk about examples of each of them. The first of these is called supervised learning. In supervised learning, we start with a data set of what's known as training data. So this would be data that maybe are categorized in a few different groups and labeled by a human. So in this example, we have, I think these are x-rays, of lungs with, I think it's tuberculosis that these people have, the ones that are labeled sick, and then we have some healthy controls. So we would put this data, we would have an expert label the data. This person has got the illness, this person does not. And then once we've labeled those, we can put that data into a machine learning algorithm, and the computer basically learns what features of an image tend to distinguish the healthy lung from the diseased lung. In the case of images, typically that's done by actually looking pixel by pixel. So it's like, pixel 55 in a healthy lung is typically black, whereas in a sick lung it's typically white. In other types of data, non-image type data, features might be things like, for example, if we were looking at house prices, things like the size, the square footage of the house, how many bedrooms it has, how many bathrooms it has. These would all be considered features, and the algorithm would look at these various features and from a very large set of labeled data, try to figure out what are the features that are most predictive to allow us to say whether, in this case, the person is sick or healthy, or predict how much another house would go for on the market. So once you put this training data into a supervised learning technique, then you would be able to give the computer another image, and it should be able to predict more or less accurately, whether that image is of a sick or a healthy person. One of the problems that we do have to deal with in supervised machine learning is what's called overfitting. So it's rarely the case that we have like a completely neat line between, you know, for example, subject A, subject B, the sick, the healthy, whatever. In this example here, this is actually supposed to be an animation, but it's not in this WebEx. But you can kind of see that like we have the black line that is a basic good, you know, way to divide the two lines. There are some blues that end up in the red side, some reds that end up in the blue side. But this black line is something that a, you know, good and accurate machine learning algorithm might suggest as a dividing line. And, you know, we wouldn't be 100% accurate if we were to get shown this data set and try to guess the red versus the blue. But the problem is if we end up with one of these like really crazy sort of green lines, we've overfit our model to a particular data set. So we've managed to create some sort of a, you know, crazy kind of algorithm that would 100% accurately predict this particular data set. But if we look at a different data set, we're not going to have those same sorts of outliers. And so this model is not going to be very accurate at predicting for other data sets or for the sort of larger population. So the way that we sort of you know, protect against overfitting to a particular data set and therefore ending up with an algorithm that doesn't really scale to other data is by using training and test data. So when we have our data set, we have, you know, think back to those lungs. Let's say we have 1,000 lungs that we've had our clinician label as being sick or healthy. Rather than feeding all 1,000 of those lungs into our algorithm, we're going to split our data up into our training data and our test data. So 80%, 800 of our lungs, we are going to feed into that algorithm, but we're going to save back 200 of those lungs, and we're going to use that as test data to figure out if the model that we developed is actually good, how accurate it is at guessing on similar data, this test data, or if we've ended up overfitting our data or overfitting our model to our data in this particular case. So typically, again, this 80-20 split is how we would do it. And having this 20% test data allows us to be a little bit more confident that the model that we've developed is actually going to be accurate when we put it out in the real world and are trying to do this on unlabeled data. So that is supervised learning. What if we don't know in advance necessarily what our clusters are or what our categories might be? We can do something called unsupervised learning, also known as clustering. So in clustering, we start with unlabeled data. We don't necessarily know. We have all these data points. We maybe don't know, you know, which person is sick, which person is healthy. In this case, you know, we're trying to decide between blue, red, and green dots. In the case of unsupervised learning, we would feed that unlabeled data in to the algorithm. It would look at those features and try and figure out what are the sort of, you know, characteristics that make different items similar to each other, and hopefully sort those into correct groups. So again, we don't know necessarily in advance what those groups might be, but the algorithm sort of figures out and spits out and says, okay, here are your groups 1, 2, and 3, and then I, as a subject matter expert, can come back in and say, okay, group 1 appears to be all dots that are blue. Group 2 appears to be all dots that are red. An example of an unsupervised learning sort of application that I was working on with one of my colleagues is taking articles and looking at their mesh headings and trying to sort of figure out different categories of articles in this really, really large data set of articles. So by looking at all of the different mesh terms that articles were tagged with, this algorithm was able to figure out similar articles by looking at sort of patterns of you know, mesh terms that were often cited together in these sorts of things. So again, the machine didn't necessarily know what those patterns meant, but we as subject matter experts could then go back and say, oh yeah, this is a group of articles that's about you know, stem cell therapy or whatever it might be. So that is unsupervised learning. The distinction of supervised versus unsupervised comes from whether the data is labeled or not. So in unsupervised learning, we have the unlabeled data, whereas in supervised learning, we have the labeled data. So another application in data science is text mining, and sort of related to that is natural language processing, or NLP. These are techniques that basically help us to find meaning in textual data. We can get a lot out of things like, numbers and images, but language is actually a little bit harder to work with. Natural language, the way that we usually talk, is very complex and difficult for computers to make sense of. This is especially true when we're talking about clinical data. So for example, a clinician might say something like, patient denied chest pain. And so, the word denied is a negative. We know that that means that there is not chest pain, but if we just looked and saw chest pain, we would have to understand that meaning of denied. So there's a lot of very complicated structures in natural language, but NLP techniques make it possible for computers to essentially parse out the language into parts and understand the relationship between those parts. So for example, here is a sentence that has been parsed, and what are called entities within the text have been extracted. So things like Shakespeare is an entity, Hamlet is an entity, English is an entity, and their relationships to each other have been determined. So for example, Hamlet has been determined to be a type of a book, and it has a relationship with Shakespeare in that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. So all of these things are sort of necessary to parse out and understand those relationships to really get the meaning out of the sentence. So these techniques, also can be useful in a variety of biomedical applications. One, like I mentioned, is electronic health records, so the narrative text that a clinician would have written about a patient, and other types of text exist as well that people use these sorts of NLP techniques on as well. The National Library of Medicine does do some research on NLP in terms of looking at whether it is possible to do some automatic classification of articles. As you probably know, actual people have to go through and read articles and figure out what mesh terms are assigned to them. So, if it was possible for a computer to do that, obviously it would be a lot quicker than having a person have to go through and look. But again, it's a very complicated task because of the fact that this is written in natural language. So those are a few of the techniques that are commonly used in data science. What are the ways that people go about that? Like I mentioned earlier, Excel, generally not a workable tool for doing data science just because it can't handle the larger sort of amount of data that most data scientists are typically working with, as well as the fact that most researchers are not using sort of point-and-click programs because essentially you're limited in terms of what you can do. The way that a point-and-click program works is that it contains a set number of things you can do. There are buttons that you click on to do them. But if you want to do something other than that, sort of outside of that, come up with your own analysis, write your own algorithms, you're not able to do that. So most data scientists and people who are working sort of extensively with data are using more code-based tools. So the software packages on the left are commonly used, but these are proprietary. So their output is in a closed format that can only be accessed using that software. So if I gather my data, do my analysis, and I've used SAS or SPSS, and I want to share that with someone else, they also have to have SAS or SPSS. This is somewhat problematic because the software tends to be somewhat expensive, so it really limits who all can get access to your data. So for that reason, and for a variety of other reasons, many data scientists are moving more towards open source solutions, which are free, for one thing. That's always a good thing. And they're more sort of widely applicable. So, because it's free, anybody can go download R or Python or Julia, and you don't have to pay for it. And so if I want to use your data, no problem, very easy. So these three examples that I've listed here are R, Python, and Julia are all programming languages that are commonly used within the data science community. So again, rather than being a program that we point and click to do our analysis, we write all of our analysis or our visualization, as the case may be, using code. So it can be time-consuming and difficult sometimes to learn a programming language, especially for researchers that don't have a really extensive computer science background. But I think most researchers that I've worked with, and I myself, I program in R, find it worth the effort in the long run because knowing a programming language allows you to do really highly specialized analyses and create customized visualizations, and you're really sort of, you're no longer limited to just a sort of like set menu of items that are available in a program. You're able to do really anything that you want with your data. So a lot of different free options available for learning all of this kind of stuff, lots of MOOCs, massive online open courses for learning this, tons of books. So again, it's time consuming, but if you're someone that works with data on a regular basis, ultimately I think worth it. So one of the reasons why I think coding is useful is, like I said, customizability. So this is an actual real example of some data that a researcher came to me with. This is his plot from Excel, and as you can see, it's kind of a mess. It did some weird stuff. There were each colored line, I think, is a different subject, and they didn't have the same number of, I think these were blood draws or something. They didn't have the same number of blood draws from each patient, and so because of that, we got this sort of like nonsense looking chart, and it was really difficult to sort of figure out what was going on here. So this was really all he could come up with in Excel, and he was not happy with this. So he asked if I could help him come up with a better looking chart using R, and this is what I came up with. So, it took a long time, well, not that long really, but it took a while to write this. It took longer than clicking one button in Excel. But we were able to, end up with these charts where you could really a lot more easily see what was actually going on. And I came up with 2 different versions just by slightly modifying the code, and he was able to pick the one that he liked. So, again, if you're doing anything that is more complicated than just, a simple line chart or bar chart or a basic, give me the average of these numbers, typically a programming language is going to be a more efficient way to do that than something like Excel. Another reason that coding languages are sort of emphasized in the data science and overall general scientific communities is the sort of ability to replicate and reproduce the research that comes out of this. So if you were to do some sort of an analysis in Excel and you wanted to, or maybe say you were going to clean up your data, you would have to sort of manually, record everything that you had done. Like, for example, I'm going to, I have collected my male subjects, I've coded as M, and my female I've coded as F, but I want to change that to male and female. If I could do that with a find and replace, but I would need to record that I've done that to indicate that I've made this change. So it can be time consuming to really document everything that you've done in terms of analysis and processing if you're using these point and click programs. If you're writing code, basically as you go, you're creating your documentation. All of the code explains exactly what you've done. And if you're commenting your code, like you can see in line 19, this line starts with the 2 pound signs. That indicates that this is a comment. It explains what I'm about to do in this next line of code. And so I can go back and look and sort of remember what I did last week. Other people can go back and look and see what I was doing with this code, and everything's sort of clear and documented. So if I was to share this with somebody, they could easily recreate, as long as they had the data, they could easily recreate the charts that I had just shown you. This is the code that I used to create those 2 charts. And I could, easily share this. There are sites like GitHub, for example, where people share code, and you can freely share that, and anybody can go and download it. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what big data is, what data science is all about, what we're doing sort of now in the current, climate of scientific research. But what should we be thinking about as we look ahead? How can we sort of strategically plan for what might be coming in terms of data? This is a really rapidly evolving field. Things change very quickly from one year to the next. Both the technologies change, new things are being developed all the time, and the policies change. So, funders, journals may be coming out with new policies that people have to comply with. Things have changed significantly even in the last 5 years, and will continue to do so very likely for the foreseeable future. So, what should we be thinking about as we look ahead? One thing that we do know for sure is that data is only going to get bigger. We have a lot of data right now, and we can expect that we're going to get even more. So, one of the implications for this is that, as a community, we need to think about how we can do better at, preserving and sharing that data, ensuring that the data is discoverable so that other researchers can access it and make use of it. But also thinking about what researchers need to do to ensure that they are storing their own data in a way that will, make it accessible to others and make it accessible, 5 or 10 years down the line. Funding is something that researchers might have to think about. If we're going to need to save this data, it's definitely cheaper than it used to be, but it's not free. So how are we going to fund, saving a terabyte of data for, 10 years? So these are all things that researchers really already should be thinking about as they start to get into the process of collecting or reusing data. Another thing that I think is going to be really significant moving forward is figuring out ways that we can leverage unstructured data. Basically, these are techniques that help us deal with data that's not as easy to analyze. So structured data are things like spreadsheets. They're categorized, they're well described, we sort of know what we're looking at, but this is really only the tip of the iceberg. Unstructured data is more like stuff like that free text, that natural language that we talked about. There are sort of preliminary techniques that allow us to do some analysis with this, but there's a lot more that really needs to be done for us to be able to fully take advantage of this unstructured data. Because, again, this is really a huge bulk of data that's available. And so as researchers, want to be able to take advantage of this, we need to work on developing new methods for handling this type of unstructured data and extracting meaning from it. So I expect a lot of developments in this sort of arena in the next 5 to 10 years. Another thing that we need to think about is training data scientists, because to do this type of science, think back to that slide where we had the Venn diagram with the 3 parts. It's not enough just to be a subject matter expert. You also have to have the statistics. You also have to have the programming expertise. So one way of thinking about this, which comes from a blog that I have linked to at the bottom, is to sort of think of the modern researcher as pie-shaped. So the classic researcher was sort of T-shaped, where they had a depth of knowledge in a very specific field, but not a really broad breadth of knowledge. Whereas the modern researcher has to have both that depth of knowledge in their specialty and in stats and in computing, and have that sort of breadth of knowledge to be able to encompass all of those different ideas. So the type of training that people are going to need to accomplish this is a little bit different from what people might have done in graduate programs thus far. So the way that a lot of approaches have been taken to training sort of this next generation of data scientists is either taking people that already have that subject matter expertise, so people who have gotten PhDs in a science, people who are MDs or clinicians, and then sort of filling in their computer science training. Or the alternative is to take people that are more traditionally trained in computer science and to teach them about the domain knowledge, give them a course in molecular biology or something. So, again, to have a working, community of data scientists, you really need people that have all of those techniques. And so I think, coming up with training programs to be able to address that is going to be really important moving forward. And for us as librarians, thinking about how we can support those programs, I think, is also a really significant, concern. So I've talked a lot about, sort of generally speaking, what this is all about. Hopefully, as I've been talking, you've maybe gotten kind of inspired about things you could do at your library. What we do at my library is a few things. I am the head of the data services program. I have a small team who assists, but I'm really the only full-time person that's devoted entirely to data. And because of that, there's only one of me and a lot of the researchers. Our program really focuses on training, especially classroom training. So I do a lot of classes on using some of the tools and the methods that I've discussed here. Often those classes will lead to consultations. So I'll teach somebody how to use R or whatever the tool might be that we're talking about. And then they come and meet with me one-on-one to get additional help on how to actually apply that to their particular use case. Another thing that we do is assistance with locating data sets for either reanalysis or for doing machine learning algorithms, as well as, it's not on this slide, but helping people to share their data. So, this is a somewhat new requirement that for many researchers that they share their data. And so they don't necessarily know, like, how do I share my data? Where do I share my data? So that's something that we can also consult on. And then I think a really important thing is this idea of community building. There's, as I think in a lot of institutions, NIH is very siloed. There's a lot of people that have expertise and interests, but they're, in different departments or in different institutes, so they don't talk to each other. And so I think the library is a really great place to bring together all of those different people that wouldn't normally talk to each other, get everyone in the same room and sort of build community so we can, create collaboration, build on expertise that people already have. So we've started doing things like, having events, having like a mentoring program for scientists who are, maybe a little bit more experienced and want to help out others. So all of these things I think are really important in sort of, giving researchers the tools that they might need to, take advantage of what's already available to them. So that brings us to the end. We have a little bit of time if anybody wants to ask any questions. I also invite you, if you're interested, to follow up with me with any questions that you have. My email and my Twitter handle are listed there. I also I have my blog listed there. This is entirely unofficial. It is in no way associated with the NIH. It's kind of a nerd blog in general. I talk a lot about data science stuff there, so a lot of the stuff that I've kind of talked about here, as well as I am in a PhD program, and so I write about, my research, which unsurprisingly is about data, and I also write about my dog, so you can see pictures of this annoying dog who's been barking during this webinar. So any questions? Okay, I see a few. So one from someone who works in a hospital library and doing help locating data sets, but how to take further steps. So hospital librarians, I'm always excited when hospital librarians are getting involved in data. I have never myself worked in that particular arena, but I will say that there's a really good chapter in the MLA data management book that I edited that is by a hospital librarian who basically just got interested in doing this and what she could do to sort of help in their library at the hospital. She ended up building off of I always get the actual name of this incorrect. It's the New England Collaborative Data Management Curriculum or something like that. If you Google New England data management, you'll find it. She, I believe, built off of that and did some instruction on data management. So looking at how to help promote some data management expertise in her library. So those are some potential ideas. But yeah, I'm really excited that a hospital librarian is interested in that. So a question about NIH data sets and where to find them. So that's a good question and one that's not easily answered. There are, because the NIH funds so many different types of research, the data is, very diverse and exists in a lot of different locations. And so there's not like one central NIH data repository at this time. However, I will say that one of the things that the NIH funded recently is the development of what's called DataMed. This will sort of be like the PubMed for data. So the idea is that, eventually, we will have one central location where not necessarily all the data is saved there, but it'll be like PubMed in that we can go and search for something and locate a lot of different data from different sources. So that, not currently available, but that is something to look for in the future. For now, there is a website that if you Google NIH, I don't remember what you'd have to Google to find it, but there is a list of NIH data repositories. It is not in any way, you know, exhaustive, but some data sets are located there. Let's see. So one question from any particular MOOCs or books that you've used that you would recommend to others who would like to get into R but have very limited coding experience? How I got into stuff was I used the Coursera data science specialization. I've known many people who have taken that specialization. It was a good way to get started. I found it a little frustrating. I often didn't know what I was doing, and so I was really discouraged. But the thing that worked really well for me is, and maybe this is just my learning style, I preferred to learn from a book, and the book that I used is called R for Everyone, and I don't recall the name of the author offhand, but it was, I thought, a really good book because it didn't assume a whole lot of computer science expertise. And, you know, it was very approachable to someone who, like myself, did not have any computer science background when I first sort of started doing this. I will also mention that if you go to, and I should have included this link on the slide, but maybe, Tony, you can help me follow up with some of these links for people. The website for my library, for our data services page, has all of the handouts from the classes that I give, and it goes through every single step of the exercises. And we are also working on recording the classes and developing some video tutorials. So if you want something that's sort of from a librarian point of view, those would be something that you might find useful, and they are available for you. Oh, thank you. Someone mentioned healthdata.gov, which I should have pointed out. Healthdata.gov is the subset of data.gov containing health-related data sets. It is also not exhaustive. I have found in the past that it tends to be a lot more stuff of sort of local and state health departments, but there is definitely some useful data there. So a question about how SAS is different from R. So SAS, SPSS, MATLAB, all of these are very similar to each other in that they do a lot of the same things as R. Except that a couple things, they tend to be, so they're point and click, but they also sort of write code as you go. So you can either write the code yourself in SAS, or you can just do the point and click stuff, and it will actually like write the code and document what you've done. So it's kind of a nice like intermediate, like on the way to doing code, but not quite there yet. You see what the code is because it's generated for you, and it's all nice because it's documented. The big difference, as I said, is the fact that SAS is proprietary, it costs money, and it's, you know, not necessarily everybody has it. So, you know, that is sort of a sticking point for some people. I, you know, am very much in favor of open source. I always encourage people to you know, to use those sorts of tools when they can. The other thing is that, you know, especially for people that are students, if they go to the trouble to learn SAS, it's very possible that at their next, you know, they graduate, they go do a postdoc somewhere, they go get a job somewhere, and, you know, they learned SAS, but the new place uses SPSS. You know, now they have to learn a whole new, you know, tool. So learning something like R or Python that are open source is, I feel like, a much more transferable skill than using something like SAS or SPSS, but you know, it kind of also depends on the type of analysis that you want to do. I've found that SAS and SPSS are really good for stuff like time series analysis that's a little bit more complicated in R. So depending on the area that you know, a researcher is working in, that might be a consideration. So thank you to everyone that has put links to stuff I was mentioning in the chat box. So the NIH Library Campus Guides is the data services page that I mentioned. There's a tab for each of the different classes that I teach. The Intro to R obviously would be the place to start, and links to a couple of the books. So I think we're just about out of time. Tony, any last things you need to wrap up with?
I have posted into the chat box the link for people to evaluate this webinar, and after you've completed the webinar, you will receive your MLA CE certificate. I did read earlier that there were people who had issues regarding a pop-up blocker, so that the links might not necessarily work for them through WebEx. So I will go ahead and gather all of these links, and I will go ahead and copy them and put them in an email for everyone. This webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto the NNLM YouTube page, so in case there was something that you had missed, you can go ahead to our YouTube channel. There are videos from all of our regional offices who've done other webinars as well in classes that you can go to. So if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please do so. But this webinar will hopefully be uploaded by next week. So all of the links that were listed here, as well as when the upload for the video will be available shortly. Everyone, I want to thank you for attending, and Lisa, thank you so much for doing this webinar. I learned a whole lot, and it's good to hear from Ophelia again. So, thank you again, and feel free to email me if you have any questions, and also feel free to contact Lisa in regards to data science. Thanks again.
Thanks.